Welcome to everyone joining us today. I hope we're finding you well. We're grateful to have you for today's special edition of Fighting Hate from Home, where we will be discussing the clear and present danger of conspiracy theories following this past weekend's horrific shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt will speak with Jessica Reaves from our Center on Extremism, which has worked around the clock to provide law enforcement and the ADL community with insights into this attack and the manifesto posted by the shooter. Additionally, we'll hear from ADL's New York, New Jersey Regional Director, Scott Richman, who was on site in Buffalo only hours after the attack. To get us started, I'm pleased to turn things over to ADL CEO and National Director, Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan.
Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. And I want to welcome everyone who's on our Zoom today. Thank you for joining us. I think this is certainly one of the most timely Fighting Hates from Home that we have ever done after what has been an incredibly difficult and painful week for the African-American community, for the Jewish community, for the country, and certainly for all of us here at ADL. Like all Americans, we were devastated to learn of the horrific shooting attack at the supermarket in Buffalo on Saturday afternoon that targeted everyday Americans, that targeted Black Americans specifically, who were simply doing something that most of us do at least once a week, which is shopping for groceries or working in their job. The idea that the simple act of buying food for you or your loved ones would be an act of taking a risk is just stunning. Sadly, I think in America, we've almost become inured to mass shootings like this. But this wasn't just another shooting. We quickly learned that the individual behind this shooting spree had selected his targets deliberately, had advanced the attack and prepared, plotting for weeks ahead of time so that he could single out African Americans. He drove more than 200 miles in order to target the top supermarket in a particularly or in a predominantly Black neighborhood when he knew the store would be packed with shoppers. He had identified additional targets so he could create more mayhem and murder more people. It was an act of depravity and domestic terrorism, plain and simple. And we learned from the screed that he published online that he murdered these Black people. He killed these innocents in order to ignite what he called a, quote, war between Jews and Gentiles, because he believed that Blacks and Jews are working together in some nefarious plot to populate America with non-whites. Obviously, it's the Great Replacement Theory, which we're going to talk more about today and hear about today. And sadly, the Great Replacement Theory and sinister conspiracies in general, they're not new to us. It's all too familiar because this devastating shooting was exactly the kind of domestic terror event we at the ADL have been warning about for months, even years. It's the kind of violent attack that we had hoped we would never see again in America. The kind of incident where a violent, unhinged white supremacist, fueled by hateful rhetoric and anti-Semitic conspiracies, would take a semi-automatic weapon, walk into a public space, and try to take as many lives as possible. You know, I'll be frank, I think all of us had hoped that after Charleston, that after Pittsburgh, that after Christchurch, that after El Paso, this would end. But here we are again. So for those of us who have devoted our professional lives to working on these issues, to fighting bias, to combating anti-Semitism, there's nothing harder, there's nothing more painful to learn that we're caught in this cycle once again. To have a hate crime tear apart a community. to have our staff need to work with law enforcement and console families and again counsel the community because of a violent assault, because of a grotesque murder, fueled, ignited by intolerance. You know, at ADL, we have always maintained that a hate crime is much worse than an ordinary crime because it is not just the pain inflicted on the family. It is, and by the way, that in and of itself would be enough, but it's how it terrorizes a whole community. A hate crime is a message crime. It is intended to intimidate and terrorize an entire group of people, an entire ethnic group, and to send a message that that community is somehow less human than the rest of us, that that community needs to be afraid. And that isn't alarming, it's unacceptable. I'd say, I mean, any single hate crime is one hate crime too much. And yet this week, there were these 10 people killed and 3 injured. And there was another incident in Orange County, which we're learning about. And again, this comes on the heels of so many others. Again, one life lost is one life too many. 10 lost lives is 10 times the pain. And the shock waves continue to reverberate across the Black community in Buffalo, across the Black community across the country, across the Jewish community, across all of these populations. And so that's why we're here today, to try to understand what happened, to try to make sense of the sort of inexplicable, to take stock of what we know, the factors that fueled this terror attack, so we can assess how do we go forward from here. So we can think about what do we advise our elected officials, our policymakers, our law enforcement. How do parents and educators and others help their communities, help their classrooms, help their kids cope? ADL's been fighting this kind of extremism since, for decades and decades, since the 1930s. We have the best experts in the country analyzing intolerance, monitoring extremism. And so I think we're uniquely positioned to have this conversation today. And our field staff was on the ground in Buffalo just hours after this happened. And we'll hear more about that as well today. So without further ado, I am really proud to introduce Jessica Reaves on the Fighting Hate from Home. She is one of our best analysts in our Center on Extremism. She's been tracking these kinds of incidents for years, and she is an expert in the Great Replacement theory and providing much of the insights that you're seeing on television, that you're reading about in the paper, that you're hearing about on podcasts and on the radio. That's Jessica's work. She's really one of the best. Jessica, I'd love for you to share some thoughts about the role of the Great Replacement theory and the role of social media, actually, specifically, in spreading this conspiracy and what it meant, what happened in Buffalo this weekend, and where do we go from here? Jessica?
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks to everyone for being here. So it was Saturday afternoon when the texts began rolling in, and they increased in urgency as the minutes ticked by. When a crisis like this happens, the ADL Center on Extremism staff, which includes experts in white supremacy, data scientists, and our always intrepid researchers, come together quickly. Within 30 minutes of the terrible news breaking out of Buffalo, the key players were online, making a plan and sharing initial findings. Very quickly, we got a copy of the shooter's manifesto, and 45 minutes later, we had an analysis. We knew the writings leaned heavily on the Great Replacement conspiracy theory and directly lifted rhetoric from the Christchurch manifesto. Our early grim assessment was that this looked like the latest in a long line of white supremacist attacks. As the afternoon turned into evening and then morning, the work continued. We shared our intelligence and analysis with law enforcement at the local, state, and federal levels, bringing them up to speed on the manifesto and providing our expertise on the writings that covered the assailants' weapons, which called back to white supremacist attacks in New Zealand, Pittsburgh, and Norway, among others. The ADL team in Buffalo, led by Scott, met with law enforcement in Buffalo and put Orrin Siegel, the vice president of the Center on Extremism, on the phone with them to directly share critical intelligence, even as the investigation was happening. And at the same time, we were providing ADL leadership and staff with regular updates on our findings. Our data scientists conducted a line-by-line comparison of the Buffalo shooter's manifesto and that of the Christchurch shooter, showing that the Buffalo shooter copied a full 63% of his predecessor's writings in his own hate-filled screed. As you all know, the Great Replacement conspiracy theory features prominently in both manifestos. The paranoid idea that white people are being systematically replaced, that white culture and influence are being diminished by demographic change. Great Replacement, which has deep roots in the white supremacist world, is a toxic rejection of multiculturalism, of the American character. It's a rejection of everything this country purports to stand for. The most extreme version of the Great Replacement, which is played out in this and other white supremacist attacks, embraces violent accelerationism, the belief that society as it stands is irredeemable and that only violence can bring about the ideal white state. Like the Christchurch shooter, the Buffalo assailant wrote at length about the threat of so-called, quote, white genocide. The Buffalo shooter, however, departed from his predecessor in his laser focus on the Jewish community, citing classic anti-Semitic tropes like the so-called Zionist-controlled government and the work of George Soros. It occurred to all of us as we read and analyzed and assessed, we've reached a point where each attack bears an unmistakable hallmark of a previous attack. The Buffalo shooter traveled hundreds of miles to target a Black neighborhood. The El Paso shooter did the same to target a shopping center frequented by Latinos. The Buffalo manifesto leaned heavily into Great Replacement theory, as did the Christchurch manifesto. The Buffalo shooter live streamed his attack on Twitch, just like the attacker in Halle, Germany. It struck me and many others on Saturday and into the early hours of Sunday. We know what we're doing at this point. It feels practiced, it feels rehearsed. And that's because sadly, we have experience covering these kinds of tragedies, these white supremacist attacks. Many of us have been doing this work for years, covering Dylan Roof's deadly assault on the church in Charleston, Heather Heyer's murder in Charlottesville, the rampage at Tree of Life Synagogue, the shooting at mosques in Christchurch, the attack in Poway, the killing spree in El Paso, and the attack on the synagogue in Halle, Germany. It happens over and over again. And it's heartbreaking and it's infuriating. And some of that rage must be directed at the social media platforms where the Buffalo shooter, like so many before him, found a home amidst racist violence, memes, and tropes. And we have to ask ourselves, what drives these people to these online spaces in the first place? The Buffalo shooter was, by his own admission, radicalized by 4chan content. He posted his manifesto on Google Docs and used Twitch and Discord to record his views and ultimately to share his live footage of the attack. 100 hours after the attack that left 10 people dead, footage showing their murders was still circulating online, being shared in clips and with joking commentary. The attackers in El Paso, Christchurch, and Buffalo all published manifestos, and each had a significant online presence. They are not only sharing their hate online, they are sharing blueprints. They are showing other people exactly how to follow in their footsteps. And unless social media companies take real steps to curbing the threat of online hate, we will be talking all too soon about another attack, about another brutal shooting spree. Another slice of our outrage must be directed at the pundits and in some cases politicians who are helping to spread and bolster the Great Replacement, this profoundly dangerous, racist, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that has inspired mass murder. In the days after the attack, we saw public figures echoing the extremist response to the shooting, re-upping their belief in the Great Replacement, or suggesting the attack was a false flag planned by the federal government or Democrats to somehow advance that party's agenda. The days and weeks after a major attack like this can offer moments of reflection, and that is too often extremely short-lived. But there is an opportunity here for this country to come to grips with something extremely dangerous and important and unique to this moment. An extremist conspiracy theory which posits that traditional Americans are being replaced by invaders has found a very comfortable home within a major political party. So I'm sure many of you are wondering, what do we do now? Inside the COE, we are taking a moment to mourn the terrible loss of life. We continue to track violent extremists, and we will make their lives as difficult as we possibly can, sharing information with law enforcement, with our regional offices, and working closely with all of the ADL community. We continue to pressure social media companies to do even the bare minimum to make their platforms slightly less dangerous. We will take a step back. We will assess our response, our processes, our information collection and sharing. We might try to catch up on our sleep. But most of all, we are going to learn from this horrible day. We have to. We have to because we know extremists are going to learn from it too. Thank you again for being here today. I am now going to turn it over to Scott Richman, the Regional Director of the ADL New York, New Jersey Regional Office, for his important perspective on the tragedy in Buffalo.
Thanks so much, Jessica. My job is to really offer a few reflections from my time on the ground. It was Saturday afternoon. I got word about this horrific incident. A group of us came together very quickly, and it became clear that I needed to go to Buffalo. I needed to get on the first plane, and that's what I did. Threw some stuff in a bag and made my way up there along with another colleague. And by the end of the evening, we were wandering around the site. We were speaking with law enforcement. We were interacting with the press, and there were still people there late into the evening. We wanted to make sure that we had done that. Why did I go? Well, I mean, first and foremost, I was there to represent ADL and to say how sorry I was, to offer solidarity and comfort to the Black community there. This was an attack against the Black community. It should be very clear. People were incredibly appreciative that somebody had come all that distance. And really, it was an honor to represent ADL, a name, by the way, that everybody recognized. I wore my ADL pin, and really people not only recognized it, but people approached me to talk with me and give me their views and to talk with me about how important that ADL was there. People said a lot of things to me. Some of what they said were things like, you know, they couldn't understand why they were chosen. Why would this man travel 3.5 hours to target this particular supermarket? And perhaps what I heard most was, how does a person who is so young, who's 18 years old, become so radicalized, become so filled with hate so early on in life? And another reason that I was there was to supply the intelligence of the Center on Extremism. You heard from Jessica about the important intelligence. Now, I will tell you, the Center on Extremism acted very, very quickly, comparing the Christchurch manifesto to the manifesto that this person put out, examining the gun that he used and the different symbols on the gun. So I was supplying that information to law enforcement. Not only was I meeting with them individually, but the Jewish community there put together a meeting in the synagogue, Temple Beth Zion, which is very close to the site, for law enforcement to meet with me. And I met with Homeland Security, I met with the FBI, I met with state police, and I met with local police, always giving them this intelligence from the Center on Extremism, for which they were very, very grateful. And law enforcement was not the only group that wanted intelligence. The media wanted intelligence. They wanted me to speak with them about the Great Replacement theory. They wanted ADL's expertise on camera and what could be done about this. I gave about a dozen interviews, including to CNN, MSNBC, Canadian Television, Inside Edition, ABC, and Pix11, and a bunch of local Buffalo channels. But I think the most moving part for me were the vigils, and I attended 2 of them. I attended one at True Bethel Church, and at Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church. It was there that I heard the powerful remarks of our governor, Governor Hochul. She condemned the Great Replacement theory and how much it's moved into the mainstream. But she also spoke about the fact that she's from Buffalo and how hard this hit her. And she acted quickly. You may know that yesterday she signed several important executive orders in response, and I was proud to stand by her, to stand next to her as she signed those executive orders at her office in New York City. I also heard our Attorney General, Tish James, at the vigil, and she committed to go after social media. So important. And I heard the powerful story of the superintendent of schools who stayed at the community center all day and all night on Saturday till midnight. She was with the family members who were first discovering what had happened to their loved ones. And she declared on Sunday that schools would be open on Monday, that this was not going to change their behavior in terms of opening schools, but it would change their behavior because it's not going to be business as usual at the schools. Afterwards, I offered her ADL's educational resources. We have already put out a table talk, how to have a conversation with young people about this incident, how to have a conversation about racism, how to have a conversation about extremism. If you know any teachers and administrators, get them these educational resources, which you can find on our website. They're so important. I was also there during President Biden's visit on Tuesday. I was in a crowd outside the community center as he met with the families, the grieving families. And it was a chance for me to chat with some people and get their views. Of course, they were so grateful that the president had come, but they were also hopeful that this tragedy was going to be a catalyst for change. And not to take anything away from these important speeches, but what touched me the most was the moment that Bishop Darius Pridgeon of True Bethel called up those who were connected to the tragedy during the vigil. I recall about a dozen people coming to the front of the church. Each story was more gut-wrenching than the one before, like the staff person who was hiding behind a window, praying not to be noticed by the gunman as she desperately tried to call 911. She described what could only be described as a harrowing tale of the 9/11 operator yelling at her because she wasn't speaking loudly enough. She was trying not to be noticed by this gunman. And the 9/11 operator was yelling at her to speak more loudly. And then the 9/11 operator hung up on her. There was also another woman who lost her sister, and really, on and on. Each was more gut-wrenching than the one before. And when it was over, we had a chance to comfort the people who had gone through this. It was a sort of a procession, and we each, took turns filing past them. And I would say that to me was the most emotional part. I went past a grandfather. He was thanking God for sparing his grandson. His grandson was hit in the neck and by a bullet, but the bullet went through the neck and out the other side and didn't hit anything crucial. He was thanking God for sparing his grandson, who had gone to the hospital, but it was Sunday morning and he was already home. But it was a woman that I couldn't bring myself to talk with because she was holding her nephew. Her nephew had his 3rd birthday the day before, on Saturday, the day of the shooting. The father had gone to Tops Friendly Market in order to get a cake for his son's birthday, and he never came home. I simply looked at this little boy who was bewildered, and I really couldn't say anything more. When I got to the end of the line, I came upon the bishop. And when he heard that I was from ADL, he couldn't thank me enough. There's a lot of noise. So I was sort of very close to his ear. And what I said to him in his ear was, this was not an attack on the Jews. This was an attack on the Blacks. But really, this was an attack on all of us. This man had no love for the Black community, for the Jewish community, for Latinos, for Muslims, for many groups. And this is an attack on all of us, and we stand in solidarity with you. Many people have asked me how they can help. And of course, you can help by pushing for reforms to our laws, like the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which thankfully has now passed the House and hopefully will pass the Senate. like laws dealing with extremism and ADL's Protect Plan, like reforms to social media and ADL's Repair Plan. But that's me wearing my ADL hat. But from being there, I can say there are other ways to help. This is a poor neighborhood, and it's so tragic that they were targeted. That area happens to be a food desert, an area where there's very little food. And the Tops Friendly Market, when it came into the community, was a real godsend. But now it's closed and it's a crime scene and you can't go in there. And it's really very, very distressing. And there's not enough food. As I heard the Mayor Brown, say multiple times, we are the city of good neighbors. They pride themselves on being good neighbors. That's what they call themselves. And in the days after the shooting, I saw many pop-up food distribution sites. Some of them were just local efforts, and I saw World Central Kitchen there. So getting food to these people is critical. And something else that I would say is that people are avoiding the other Tops. Tops is a chain, and people are avoiding going to Tops supermarkets because they're scared. And some of you may have seen on social media, my post went a little bit viral. I went to Tops, another Tops, on Sunday night. I went to buy some yogurt, and I went in there and I took a photo of myself and I put that online. And what I said was, I'm here in defiance of the terror that this person tried to perpetrate. And I'm here in solidarity with the people of Buffalo. And if we act out of fear and don't go to this market, then the terrorists win. And I urged people to go to the markets. And that's a very important message. We can't let the terrorists win. My last thought is that I've been the director of ADL New York, New Jersey, a real honor for me. And it's been a little more than a year and a half. And in that time, because it was mostly during the pandemic, I've done this job very much remotely. This is my home. This is my home office. And the truth is, we can all be very effective from home, but not always. And I think the lesson that I learned from Buffalo is that in cases like this, you have to show up. You have to be there. And it matters so much if you show up. And on that note, I'm going to make a little commercial advertisement. We are conducting the Walk Against Hate on Sunday, June 12th. It's going to be in New York City. And if any of you can join us, this is an opportunity for you to show up, for you to say, I'm going to do something to fight against hate. I'm going to be out there. I'm going to be counted. I'm going to be heard. So it's Sunday, June 12th. You can find information about it at our website, nynj.adl.org. And many other regions, if you're not from the New York area, also have a Walk Against Hate coming up. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm happy to answer questions. And now I'm going to turn it back to Deb Leipzig.
Thank you so much, Scott. We really appreciate your hard work and just being on the ground. I know that wasn't easy. So before we go to Q&A, I'm going to ask Jonathan to join us again. I know he had a few more remarks he'd like to make. Jonathan.
Thank you, Deb. I just want to take a moment to share with the over 1,000 people on this webinar how proud I am to work with Scott Richman. Jessica, I mentioned at the top of the Zoom, one of the best analysts that we have in our Center on Extremism. Literally, it is her insights, it is her experts that are shaping the way pundits and journalists and scholars are making sense of what happened. But Scott's determination, his compassion, his decency has been on full display this past week. Again, at the drop of a hat, he flew up to Buffalo, and at the drop of a hat, he shows up in Brooklyn after an assault. At the drop of the hat, you can find him anywhere in the Empire State or in the Garden State, helping people in need in New Jersey or New York when there's an anti-Semitic incident, when there's a hate crime, when there's an act of intolerance. And Scott is like so many of the amazing staff people we have here at ADL who give their all and are just dedicated public servants who, again, in the most selfless sort of way, have made a commitment to this work. And for someone like me, I will just say, it is humbling to have the chance to work with this kind of talent and to support them in the amazing work that they do to help all of us. So I want to use this opportunity to publicly not just acknowledge Scott's talent, as well as Jessica, as well as everyone here at ADL, but to really publicly thank him for his leadership and his heroism over the past week. Thank you, Scott. Deb, back to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, so before we go to Q&A, and as a reminder, if you have any questions for any of the panelists you've seen, you can just type them right into the chat. We do have a way for you to take action, and I know that that's certainly something we're seeing in the chat, a lot of questions about, well, what can we do and how can we help, and what can our role be? So one of the things you can do is really lean into some advocacy. And thanks to this group's advocacy, last night, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act passed in the House of Representatives. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said that he will schedule a vote for next week. So we need you to take action today. Please text the word protect to 52886, and then you click on the link and follow the directions that'll be sent right back to you, and you'll be connected with your senators. Every single call counts. And this vote is likely to be close, so we need you to start making those calls and sending those texts. All right, we've got a bunch of questions in the queue, so I'm going to invite our panelists to please turn their cameras and microphones back on, and we will jump in. All right, Scott, if you can turn your camera on, Jonathan. Great. Okay, so one of the questions that I'm seeing a bunch in the chat, and it's been asked a few different ways, is about why ADL has taken such a forward role in addressing this shooting. What is it, this wasn't a Jewish community center that was shot up. What is it that was so important that we respond to it, Jonathan?
So the ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in America. Our mission, not that I wrote or that Deb, Scott, or Jessica wrote, but the mission statement for ADL was written in 1913, long before any of us were alive. And as it is written, our obligation is to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. So for well over 100 years, we show up and we lean in and we fight back against all forms of extremism and hate. Because as our founders believed, and why they wrote this mission in this dual way, the Jewish people can only be safe when everyone is safe. There will only be justice for our community when there is justice for all communities. And that idea may be unique to ADL in the pantheon of Jewish organizations, if you will, this blend of the particular and universal being so explicit in our sort of organizational DNA. But it's a very Jewish idea. If I am not for myself, who will be? If I am only for myself, what am I? Those aren't our words. Those were Hillel's words, written thousands of years ago. So we do this work because the white nationalists who murdered 10 Black Americans in cold blood this weekend, who murdered almost 24 Latinos in El Paso almost 3 years ago, they don't just hate Latinos and Blacks, they hate Jews as well. And all of us from marginalized communities are in this together. Jews, Muslims, Black, white, AAPI, Latino, LGBTQ, straight, we are all in this together. That's our mission. That's why we do this work.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jessica, I think this one speaks pretty specifically to the work of the Center on Extremism. Can you speak a little bit about how you work with law enforcement? Are they generally receptive to the intelligence that you provide for them? Do you ever encounter resistance? And if you did, what would that look like?
Yeah, so Center on Extremism has a very long, along with ADL, has a very long history of sharing critical intelligence with law enforcement. Before attacks, we have worked very hard to thwart a number of attacks. Those, we talk about a little bit less because they're behind the scenes and it's all happening sort of as, just before the horror can begin. So Yes, we have a very strong relationship with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, as I mentioned. No, we do not encounter resistance. We are able to provide insights and intelligence into extremist methodologies, into their way of thinking, that really help to enhance any law enforcement reaction and response to this kind of extremist shooting or any kind of extremist activity. So no, it's a very much a partnership. And we've we've always been worked together very closely in that sense.
Thank you, Jessica. So Scott, this one I think is best served with an answer from you. You mentioned the walk against hate, but what else can folks be doing in their own communities to take some kind of action?
Well, certainly if they're not connected to ADL, they should be. We have 25 ADL offices across the country. All of those offices are engaged in this activity. I'm the director of one of those offices. We're all doing the same thing. We're all responding to anti-Semitic incidents. We're all doing anti-bias and anti-bullying education programs, really trying to create a better future, a future where people respect one another, where people celebrate difference and celebrate diversity rather than looking down on it. We're all working with our legislators and trying to do important advocacy, like the work that we've been doing both at the state level here and, of course, ADL across the country at the national level. There's our civil rights team. There's so many aspects. Our work with law enforcement, training law enforcement. And get involved with your ADL office, and that's really the best way for you to have an impact.
Thank you for that, Scott. So this question, I think, crosses a little bit into more than one of your expertise. So I'll ask, and you'll let me know who wants to speak up. What's being done to address the proliferation of hate and extremist ideologies online that's animating so many of these attacks? Jonathan, do you want to take that?
Sure. So ADL, through our Center on Technology and Society in Silicon Valley, is working with all of the major social media platforms and tech companies. I mean, from Apple to Zoom, from Amazon to YouTube, and everyone in between, to encourage them to, number one, simply enforce their own terms of service that would prevent the proliferation of extremism and hate on almost all these platforms. Number two, to encourage them to think about their role in enabling extremism and hate on their products. So think about the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, where people can download the kind of apps like Rumble, where this content was, you can still find videos up there today of the shooting and lots of other horrible content. So there's work to be done there. Number two, in addition to working with the companies, to think about their role and responsibility, we're also working with policymakers, encouraging legislative initiatives. Our repair plan is sort of a whole of society approach that predicates on legislative and regulatory action to hold these organizations and companies accountable. We're advising New York Attorney General Tish James on her latest undertaking. She announced an investigation. So we are knee deep in working with the regulators and elected officials. And then finally, we're willing to kind of organize public campaigns in coalition with other civil rights group. Our Stop Hate for Profit initiative 2 years ago brought together ADL, NAACP, Color of Change, Common Sense, and many other organizations, and held Facebook accountable. We were able to secure a series of concessions from Facebook, like classifying Holocaust denialism as hate speech, like taking down white supremacist Facebook groups, like removing racist content. And so we will continue to do that. And we do that work, just to be clear, whether it's policy work, engaging the companies, working with civil rights groups, not because we believe in censorship, we don't believe in censorship, but banning incitement isn't the same thing as banning freedom of expression. Stopping slander isn't the same thing as stopping free speech. And simply making sure that the companies are liable if people libel others using their services. That's simple common sense. It should happen. We're going to try to make it happen.
I just want to add one thing. The laws governing social media in this country. It's the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Communications Decency Act of 1996 was a complete change from the way that media had been handled before. Newspaper, television, radio, they were liable if content was put on their site that there was misinformation, there was hate on there. But by 1996, the internet was there, and the government did not want to put controls in place on the internet, did not want to stifle this new medium. They didn't realize what was coming in 2004 with Facebook, and on and on. We still live with that law. We still live with the law that says that internet companies are not liable for what is put on their site. And our repair plan, as Jonathan mentioned, it calls for reform of that law, which we still live with.
Thank you for that addition, Scott. So this question, I'd love to get both a local and a national perspective on, but folks are wondering a little bit about how we work with other civil rights organizations and other social justice organizations when it comes to a response like this, and just in general, and how we partner throughout doing this kind of work. Jonathan, maybe you can start.
The ADL, on the back wall here, I have a picture of my predecessor standing in the Rose Garden with Martin Luther King and President LBJ and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, but also Roy Wilkins, the CEO of the NAACP. The ADL has been working with the NAACP and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund literally since the 1950s. We've been working with Latino, LGBTQ, Muslim, many other advocacy groups for decades and decades. Frankly, I'm proud that we incubated the Asian American Foundation last year in response to the rise of anti-AAPI hate. And I'm just so amazed by the work we continue to do with so many. So sometimes that means, like hours after the attack, I was on the phone with the CEOs of some of the most significant African-American advocacy organizations in the country, talking about what we could do together. I'm proud of the joint statement we released just less than 12 hours after the shooting on Sunday morning with the National Urban League, with the League of United Latin American Citizens, with the National Action Network, and with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, calling for a White House summit on hate crimes. So we are in dialogue. I'm in dialogue with my peers at other civil rights groups. We are doing collaborative work with different organizations, all kinds of partnerships with NAA and Urban, TAF, and LULAC, many of the groups I've already mentioned. But most of the stuff that we do, the rubber meets the road on the ground in the communities where we work. So it's appropriate for Scott to talk a little bit about how things manifest, I think, at a local level here in New York, as you kind of teed up, Devin.
Sure. And, I could tell you in terms of the Urban League. So you are working at the national level with the Urban League. I met with the head of the Urban League for Buffalo. We actually attended one of the vigils together. We work very closely with the NAACP. In fact, we have a memorandum of understanding with the New Jersey NAACP. We speak out with one voice on issues of racism and anti-Semitism. We've conducted a listening tour to different universities where we model how Blacks and Jews can come together and work together for a better society. And Jonathan's being a little bit modest about the Asian American Foundation. Asian American Foundation, Jonathan is the only non-Asian founding board member. And we work closely with the Asian community, in the terrible spike, the terrible violence that they've experienced over the past few years. We, as an organization, are a bit unique. We fight hate. And that's been our sole mission, anti-Semitism and hate, since 1913. Unfortunately, we have a lot of experience, and we offer that experience as allies to these communities.
Thank you, Scott. So Jessica, riffing off that same theme, does the Center on Extremism also work with other organizations, other NGOs, other partners within the Jewish community? How do those relationships work?
Yeah. Center on Extremism actually has a very robust partnership program. We actually have someone specifically in our group who works on that, and he's doing an amazing job of finding other researchers, other experts that we can work with. And, there's a lot of synergy to be had. Sometimes you're working from one particular angle and somebody else happens to take a different perspective or is just looking at different sites or different, has a different way of coming at the information. So we're very lucky in that sense that we're able to work so closely with a number of other groups. We've certainly provided a lot of intel and information to various social media platforms. We are trying to get them to address these issues. And all of this is to the end of, trying to make spaces, whether they are public spaces or online spaces, safer for everybody and less contaminated by the hate that unfortunately we seem to be inundated with on a daily basis.
Thank you, Jessica. So shifting gears a little bit, we've had a variety of questions around what's being done at a federal level to really address these kinds of attacks and hate crimes in general. And perhaps we can also address a little bit more about what the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act will actually do.
I guess that's for me.
Yeah, I think Jonathan.
So, there are a few things. The ADL was a driving force between getting hate crimes laws conceptualized and passed in the United States back in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Literally, we helped to write some of the earliest model legislation, worked with state legislators and got it passed at a state level, and then helped to lead the coalition of civil rights organizations that worked the Capitol Hill to get the hate crimes law, the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crimes Act passed, and then signed into effect by President Barack Obama in early 2009. Flash forward to today, we continue to push the federal government, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, to expand its program called Nonprofit Security Grants that makes funding available to houses of worship and communal institutions that could be vulnerable to this kind of hate crimes and attacks. We work with the Department of Justice to make sure that it is using all the powers at its disposal to pursue the people who perpetrate hate crimes, and that through the FBI, local law enforcement is investigating and tracking these incidents with appropriate urgency, let alone reporting on them. So Jessica and her peers as an extremism can understand what the full picture of hate crimes really looks like, since we know these incidents are underreported. We're working actively with the White House to make sure there is, and with our council and that of other organizations too. The White House released last year the first ever national strategy to counter domestic terrorism. By the way, that document, that plan, will have its 1-year anniversary next month, and ADL was critically involved in advising folks at the National Security Council and who work for the Homeland Security Council as they put that plan together. So from the Department of Justice to the Homeland Security to the White House to law enforcement authorities like the FBI, we're very engaged. Specifically as relates to legislation, I mentioned the Hate Crimes Act. I'd also call out the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which is about making sure that law enforcement has adequate training and adequate resources to tackle this issue as it manifests on the ground. This is one of our key legislative priorities. There was a lot of bipartisan support, and then it sputtered a bit when the squad got involved and tried to block it. But thankfully, with the support of much of the Congressional Black Caucus, we're able to get this thing through. And I think what happened this past weekend, the tragedy, only underscores why this law was so necessary. So make sure that law enforcement has adequate training, that they have adequate resources, so these kinds of crimes are tackled with appropriate urgency and intensity.
Thank you for that.
Scott, did you want to add to that? No.
Nope.
Okay.
Covered it.
Okay. So there's been lots of questions about the media. And I'd like to take two different angles on this. Jessica, I wonder if you can speak a little bit to what you've seen as you've been researching and following along with how the media has really been perpetrating things like great replacement theory and things like misinformation. And maybe you can speak to that a little bit. And Jonathan, we'd also like to hear from you and have you answer a similar question. So Jessica, let's start.
Yeah. So it's no surprise to anyone that we are seeing great replacement echoed across media outlets. We are seeing it promoted. ADL has spoken out strongly against some of that very specific rhetoric that has been on the airwaves and very accessible. The great replacement theory is actually not. It doesn't have its basis in the United States. It's originally from a French philosopher, and it has been taken on, as I mentioned, in various sort of iterations here. One is more extreme, the accelerationist view of, let's start a race war to, return America to, quote, what it was supposed to be. And the other view is that what we are seeing in some media outlets and being promoted by some public figures, unfortunately. And that is this idea that there is an invasion happening and that white people need to be afraid of this, or legacy Americans, as they are sometimes referred to, need to be afraid of this. And it's this idea, that there is something to be afraid of. And this is something that white supremacists and extremists of all kinds lean heavily into, is this sense of fear, this sense of grievance. And we see it repeated over and over again. And unfortunately, we are seeing that echoed in a number of media outlets, and as I mentioned, by a number of public officials. And it is incumbent on all of us, I think, to call it out as we have and as we will continue to do.
I mean, honestly, I think Jessica's given us a very good answer to that, Deb. I don't have a lot more to add.
Okay.
I just want to say, and maybe I'm sure I heard this on the ground, but how particularly disgusting it is to think about this great replacement theory being applied to the Black community who came here as slaves, who came here in chains. It's really so incredibly offensive.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. So before we end today's call, Scott, is there anything else that you'd like to add about your experience having been on the ground in Buffalo? Anything that you'd like to share before we have everyone depart for the day?
I'll just, first of all, thank everybody for being on this call. There's an incredibly large number of people here. Obviously, this is an issue that resonates for people. And, let this be a catalyst for change. This shouldn't just be something that happens and then we wait for the next incident to happen. And that's what we're dealing with here. I mean, as we heard, there's a through line through all of these incidents: Christchurch and Charleston and El Paso and Poway and Pittsburgh. And we don't want to be waiting for the next one to happen. So this hopefully will be a catalyst for change. I'm very heartened by the governor's executive order, by the statements I've heard from the Attorney General, and now what's being done at the national level. But every one of us should be acting. Every one of us should be, trying to create the kind of civil society where we push hate to the margins, where we push extremism to the margins, which is the traditional way that hate is controlled, by civil society playing their role. And in this time of polarization, it's very, very difficult to do that. We need to come back to the center. We need to strengthen the center. And every one of us can play a role. Please reach out to your ADL office to see what you can do.
Thank you for that, Scott. So we understand that some folks are having trouble with the texting instructions that were sent before, that we talked about before. So we're going to drop a link into the chat that will take you directly to where you can get the information you need to reach out to your senators. Again, we think this is going to be a very close vote, which means these calls matter. So we appreciate that. We will also be sending this information in our follow-up email following the program. And with that, I would very much like to thank Jessica Reaves, Scott Richman, and Jonathan for taking time today. It's been a very long week for all of you, and we are extremely grateful. I have to say, I am always just so in awe of my colleagues, the way they work through these things, just how smart and articulate you are. And I just want to personally thank you for all that you're doing. And thanks to everyone else who's on the line today for joining us. Again, we will be following up with some more action steps for you to take and additional resources. And until next time, please stay well, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, everyone.